Chemical warfare in Vietnam wasn't just Agent Orange. American forces faced multiple chemical threats throughout the war, some from their own side, others from the enemy. These chemicals caused immediate casualties, long-term health effects, and created tactical nightmares that endangered entire units. This breakdown covers the most dangerous chemical weapons that affected U.S. soldiers based on military medical records, declassified operational reports, and documented health studies. The focus is on immediate tactical dangers and documented casualties, not just long-term health effects. If you're a veteran watching this, you already know the use of these weapons intimately. For everyone else, pay attention, because this is the side of war that rarely makes it into textbooks or movies. Starting with the weapons most people don't know about. CS gas was the military's riot control agent, but in Vietnam, it became a combat weapon with deadly consequences for American troops who used it. The primary use was clearing tunnel complexes. Tunnel rats would pump CS gas into tunnel systems to force Viet Cong fighters out or make the tunnels uninhabitable. The Viet Cong had other plans. They built ventilation systems, gas-proof doors, and wet cloths over entrances to filter the gas. More dangerously, they waited for Americans to enter the tunnels after gassing them. Tom Mangold's The Tunnels of Cu Chi documents multiple incidents where tunnel rats entered recently gassed tunnels and were overcome by residual CS. The gas lingered in enclosed spaces far longer than expected. Tunnel rats would put on gas masks, enter tunnels, then have to remove masks in tight spaces where the masks wouldn't fit. The residual CS would incapacitate them. Several documented cases involve tunnel rats being found unconscious in tunnels after CS exposure. Some died not from the gas directly, but from being unable to escape when they encountered enemy forces or structural collapses while incapacitated. The Viet Cong learned to use CS against American forces. They would capture CS grenades and save them. When American troops entered tunnel systems or bunker complexes, the Viet Cong would detonate captured CS grenades in enclosed spaces. One Marine Corps after-action report from 1967 describes a squad entering a bunker complex that was then filled with CS by enemy forces. 3 Marines were incapacitated and had to be dragged out while the unit was taking fire. The tactical disadvantage of being gassed in an enclosed space during active combat was catastrophic. Beyond tunnels, CS was used for crowd control and area denial, but the wind in Vietnam was unpredictable. Multiple incidents involved CS gas blowing back onto American positions. Units would gas an area to deny it to the enemy, then have wind shifts blow the gas into their own positions, incapacitating friendly forces. The chemical wasn't designed to kill, but the tactical effects could be fatal. Soldiers overcome by CS couldn't fight, couldn't see, couldn't breathe effectively. In combat, that meant death. Medical records show several combat deaths where CS incapacitation was a contributing factor. Soldiers were overcome by gas and killed by enemy fire before they could recover. Long-term exposure to CS also created health problems. Repeated exposure caused chronic respiratory issues. Some soldiers developed chemical sensitivity that persisted after the war. While not as severe as other chemical exposures, the cumulative effect of regular CS exposure damaged soldiers' respiratory systems. Napalm was an American weapon, but it injured and killed American soldiers with disturbing regularity through proximity burns and misdirected strikes. The weapon itself was jellied gasoline that stuck to whatever it touched and burned at extreme temperatures, over 1800 degrees Fahrenheit. When napalm struck, it created firestorms that consumed everything in the impact zone. The heat was so intense, it could kill through radiant heat alone, even if the flames didn't directly touch you. Airstrikes with napalm required precise coordination between ground forces and aircraft. In the chaos of combat, with smoke, confusion, and communication difficulties, that precision often failed. Multiple documented incidents involved napalm strikes hitting American positions or landing danger close. One incident from the Battle of Hamburger Hill involved napalm strikes that landed within 100 meters of American positions. The radiant heat caused burns to soldiers who weren't even in the direct impact zone. Several soldiers suffered severe burns. The heat was so intense it ignited ammunition and equipment. Samuel Zafiri's Hamburger Hill documents the terror of calling in napalm strikes when your own position is only a few hundred meters from where the napalm will hit. The margin for error is tiny. A slight miscalculation in coordinates, a gust of wind pushing the aircraft off course, a pilot's targeting error, any of these could put napalm on friendly forces. The burns from napalm were uniquely horrific. The jellied gasoline stuck to skin and clothing, continuing to burn even if the victims tried to remove it. Water wouldn't put it out effectively. Soldiers caught in napalm strikes often died from their burns, either immediately or days later from infection and shock. Medical personnel described napalm burns as the worst injuries they treated. The burns went deep, destroying multiple layers of tissue. The pain was excruciating. Infection was almost guaranteed. Even soldiers who survived faced months of recovery and often permanent disfigurement. Beyond direct strikes, napalm created secondary hazards. The fires it started would spread through dry vegetation, creating additional burn zones that could trap friendly forces. The smoke from napalm fires was toxic. Burning petroleum products and whatever else the napalm ignited created noxious fumes that caused respiratory damage. Several incidents involved helicopters being called in for medical evacuation from areas where napalm had been used. The heat and smoke made landing extremely dangerous. Pilots had to choose between risking their aircraft and crew or leaving wounded soldiers behind. Some medvac birds were damaged or crashed attempting to land in areas still burning from napalm strikes. Units that experienced friendly napalm strikes became extremely reluctant to call in napalm support, even when it was tactically necessary. The fear of another targeting error made commanders hesitant to use one of their most effective weapons against fortified positions. White phosphorus, called Willie Pete or WP, was used for marking targets and creating smoke screens. It was also a chemical weapon that caused horrific injuries to anyone it touched, including American soldiers. White phosphorus ignites on contact with air and burns at approximately 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. It can't be extinguished with water. In fact, water can make it worse by spreading the burning particles. The chemical continues burning until it's completely consumed or deprived of oxygen. When WP artillery shells or grenades exploded, they scattered burning white phosphorus particles over a wide area. Any particle that hit exposed skin would burn straight through tissue, often down to the bone. The particles would stick and keep burning. The standard treatment for WP burns was to cover the affected area with wet cloth or mud to deny oxygen to the burning particles. But in combat conditions, treating WP burns was nearly impossible. The burning particles had to be physically removed, dug out of the flesh while they were still burning. Many medics suffered burns to their own hands while trying to treat WP casualties. Multiple after-action reports document friendly fire incidents with white phosphorus, artillery WP rounds landing short of their intended targets, WP grenades being used to mark positions, with wind blowing the burning particles back onto friendly troops, helicopter door gunners dropping WP grenades that bounced wrong and scattered particles on American soldiers. One particularly well-documented incident from the Ashau Valley in 1969 involved a WP marking round that hit a tree and scattered burning phosphorus onto a platoon moving below. 4 soldiers were seriously burned. The medic who treated them was also burned. The entire platoon had to halt movement to treat casualties while they were in enemy territory. Beyond the burns, WP smoke was toxic. Breathing WP smoke caused respiratory damage. Prolonged exposure to WP smoke could cause phosphorus poisoning, leading to organ damage. Soldiers who regularly worked with WP, artillery crews, mortar teams, showed higher rates of respiratory problems. The smoke itself created tactical problems. WP smoke screens meant to conceal friendly movements could blow back onto American positions, reducing visibility for friendly forces more than enemy forces. The thick white smoke was so dense that soldiers couldn't see more than a few feet. This created dangerous situations where units lost visual contact with each other and couldn't navigate effectively. Several incidents involved soldiers becoming disoriented in WP smoke and wandering into enemy positions or off cliffs. The smoke was so thick and disorienting that maintaining unit cohesion became nearly impossible. Radio communication became critical because visual contact was lost. WP was also used as an anti-personnel weapon against fortified positions. The burning particles would force enemy soldiers out of bunkers and trenches, but this use created another problem. American infantry advancing after WP strikes would sometimes encounter still burning phosphorus particles in the area they needed to occupy. Several soldiers were burned by residual WP while moving through areas that had been struck minutes earlier. The long-term health effects of WP exposure are documented in VA medical studies, particularly deterioration of the jaw, a condition called phossy jaw that was well known from industrial phosphorus exposure. While Vietnam-era exposure was less severe than industrial exposure, effects were still documented in some veterans. Agent Orange gets the attention, but American forces used multiple defoliant chemicals in Vietnam. Agent Blue, Agent White, and Agent Purple all posed different threats. Agent Blue was used primarily against rice crops to deny food to enemy forces. The active ingredient was cacodyllic acid, an arsenic-based compound. The immediate effects weren't as severe as other agents, but the arsenic content created long-term exposure risks. Soldiers involved in spraying operations were exposed to concentrated Agent Blue. The chemical would drift during spraying and coat personnel, equipment, and base camps near spray zones. Unlike Agent Orange, which was primarily a long-term health threat, Agent Blue's arsenic could cause acute poisoning with sufficient exposure. Documented cases exist of soldiers developing arsenic poisoning symptoms, skin lesions, gastrointestinal problems, peripheral neuropathy after exposure to Agent Blue. Medical records from spray operations show multiple cases of acute illness among spray crew that were consistent with arsenic exposure. The spray operations themselves were dangerous beyond chemical exposure. C-123 aircraft flying spray missions flew low and slow, making them vulnerable to ground fire. Multiple spray aircraft were shot down. Crew members faced both enemy fire and constant chemical exposure. They were probably among the most heavily exposed personnel of the entire war. Agent White contained pichloram and 2,4-D. While considered less toxic than Orange, it still caused immediate health effects. The chemical irritated skin, eyes, and respiratory systems on contact. Soldiers exposed to Agent White's spray drift reported burning sensations, respiratory irritation, and skin rashes. One documented incident from 1967 involved an Agent White spray mission that drifted over an American base camp. Over 50 soldiers reported immediate symptoms: burning eyes, difficulty breathing, skin irritation. Several required medical treatment. The incident prompted investigations into spray operations safety, though practices changed little. Agent Purple was an early mixture that was later replaced by Agent Orange. It contained 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T in different proportions than Orange, with different impurity profiles. The tetrachlorodibenzo-P-dioxin contamination, the most toxic component, was actually higher in some Purple batches than in Orange. Personnel exposed to Purple faced similar health effects to Orange exposure, but documentation is less complete because Purple was phased out relatively early in the war. Some of the earliest reports of health problems related to defoliant exposure came from personnel who handled Agent Purple. Beyond named agents, experimental defoliants were tested in limited operations. Some of these experimental chemicals were even more toxic than the standard agents. Soldiers involved in test operations were often not informed they were being exposed to experimental chemicals. The immediate tactical effects of defoliant operations created unexpected problems. Defoliated areas became easier to traverse, but also eliminated concealment for both sides. Several units reported that defoliated jungle became tactical dead zones, too open to cross safely, offering no cover. Defoliated trees would die and fall, creating obstacle courses of dead timber. These dead forests were fire hazards. Any sparks from tracer rounds, explosions, or careless fires could ignite dead vegetation, creating wildfires that endangered both American and enemy forces. The ecological destruction from defoliants had immediate tactical consequences. Rivers and streams in defoliated areas showed increased contamination. Water sources became unreliable. Wildlife fled defoliated areas, making hunting for food supplementation impossible and eliminating early warning signs of enemy movement that wildlife disturbances had provided. The Viet Cong and NVA used chemical weapons against American forces, though documentation is less complete than American chemical use. These attacks ranged from improvised chemical weapons to sophisticated booby traps. Poison gas attacks occurred, though they were rare. Several incidents involved the Viet Cong using captured tear gas grenades. More concerning were reports of non-standard chemical agents being used in isolated incidents. A 1966 Marine Corps report describes an incident where a platoon-sized element was attacked with an unknown chemical agent delivered by mortar. The agent caused immediate respiratory distress, burning sensations, and incapacitation. Several Marines required evacuation. Chemical analysis of samples was inconclusive, but the symptoms were consistent with a chlorine-based agent. Whether this was a one-off experiment or part of a broader program remains unclear. The incident was investigated but classified. Similar reports exist in other unit records, suggesting that at least some Viet Cong or NVA units experimented with chemical warfare. Booby-trapped chemicals represented another threat. The Viet Cong would booby-trap American supplies, including chemical stores. Several incidents involved American units discovering enemy caches that contained what appeared to be American chemical weapons, tear gas, smoke grenades, possibly other agents that had been rigged as booby traps. One incident from 1968 involved engineers discovering a cache of American CS gas canisters that had been wired to detonate when the cache was disturbed. The intention was to gas anyone investigating the cache. The booby trap was disarmed, but it demonstrated the Viet Cong's willingness to turn captured chemical weapons against American forces. Contaminated food and water represent biological chemical warfare. Multiple documented incidents involve enemy forces contaminating water sources with chemicals, feces, or dead animals. American units discovering these contaminated sources avoided them, but some soldiers drank contaminated water before contamination was recognized. The symptoms ranged from mild gastrointestinal distress to severe poisoning, depending on the contaminant. Several soldiers died from drinking contaminated water, though determining whether contamination was deliberate or incidental is difficult from historical records. The U.S. military used industrial quantities of pesticides in Vietnam to control disease-carrying insects. These pesticides created chemical exposure risks that are often overlooked. Malathion was sprayed extensively around base camps and operational areas to control mosquitoes. The organophosphate insecticide is toxic to humans in sufficient doses. While the concentrations used were supposed to be safe, the volume of spraying and frequency of exposure created accumulation risks. Soldiers stationed at bases that were regularly sprayed with malathion showed elevated rates of neurological symptoms, headaches, dizziness, nausea, muscle twitching. These symptoms are consistent with organophosphate poisoning. While usually not severe enough to require evacuation, the chronic low-level exposure created health problems. Spray crews and personnel who handled concentrated malathion had higher exposure. Several documented cases exist of acute malathion poisoning among personnel who handled the chemical improperly or were exposed to concentrated solutions. Symptoms included severe nausea, sweating, respiratory difficulty, and, in serious cases, seizures. DDT was still widely used in Vietnam despite concerns about its effects. Base camps were fogged with DDT. Sleeping areas were sprayed. Equipment and supplies were treated. The exposure was constant and unavoidable. The immediate effects of DDT exposure were less obvious than other chemicals, but soldiers reported various symptoms: skin irritation, dizziness, nausea. The long-term effects of DDT exposure became clearer decades after the war. But even during the war, some medical personnel questioned the safety of the massive DDT use. One Army medical report from 1968 noted elevated rates of neurological complaints among personnel at a base camp where DDT fogging occurred daily. The report suggested reducing fogging frequency, but the recommendation was largely ignored due to disease control concerns. Other pesticides used included various organophosphates and carbamates. The cumulative exposure to multiple pesticide chemicals created what some medical researchers later termed toxic soup, multiple chemical exposures that interacted in unpredictable ways. Base camps were chemical environments. Defoliants drifted from nearby spray operations, pesticides were sprayed regularly, fuel, oil, and other petrochemicals were omnipresent. Soldiers breathed, ate, and absorbed a mixture of chemicals whose combined effects were never properly studied. The immediate tactical effects of pest control operations included making some areas temporarily uninhabitable due to chemical concentrations. After heavy spraying, soldiers would evacuate areas for hours to let chemicals disperse. This created tactical vulnerabilities. If enemy forces knew spray schedules, they knew when areas would be temporarily abandoned. CN gas, or chloroacetophenone, was another tear gas compound used in Vietnam. It was actually more toxic than CS, but was used less frequently. The occasions when CN was employed created severe problems. CN causes intense eye pain, skin irritation, and respiratory distress. Unlike CS, which soldiers could often fight through for brief periods, CN was incapacitating to most personnel. When CN was used in combat operations, it often affected friendly forces as severely as enemy forces. The CN achieved nothing tactically except to incapacitate friendly forces. DM, Adamsite, was a vomiting agent that saw limited use in Vietnam. This chemical caused extreme nausea, vomiting, and respiratory distress. It was supposed to be non-lethal, but in enclosed spaces or with heavy exposure, it could cause serious injury or death. The use of DM was controversial even during the war. It violated at least the spirit of chemical weapons conventions, though the U.S. military argued it was a riot control agent rather than a war gas. Regardless of legal arguments, the effects were severe enough that many soldiers refused to handle or deploy DM. Smoke compounds used for screening and signaling weren't technically riot control agents, but some had toxic effects. Certain colored smoke grenades released compounds that caused respiratory irritation and nausea when breathed in concentrated amounts. Purple smoke and yellow smoke grenades particularly caused problems. The chemical compounds that created these colors were more toxic than those in white or gray smoke. Soldiers in enclosed spaces with colored smoke grenades reported severe symptoms. One helicopter crash investigation noted that the crew had deployed multiple colored smoke grenades to signal their position after going down. The concentration of smoke inside the damaged helicopter caused respiratory distress severe enough that crew members had difficulty escaping the aircraft. The smoke meant to save them nearly killed them. The tactical doctrine for riot control agents assumed they'd be used in open areas with good ventilation. Vietnam's jungle canopy, enclosed bunkers, and tunnel systems didn't match these assumptions. The gases would concentrate, persist longer than expected, and affect friendly forces unexpectedly. Agent Orange was the most widely used chemical defoliant in Vietnam, approximately 11 to 12 million gallons sprayed over 6 years. Unlike the chemicals discussed earlier, Agent Orange's primary threat wasn't immediate incapacitation, but long-term health destruction. The chemical mixture was roughly 50% 2,4-D and 50% 2,4,5-T. The 2,4,5-T was contaminated with TCDD dioxin, one of the most toxic compounds known. The contamination wasn't intentional, just a byproduct of the manufacturing process. Different production batches had varying dioxin concentrations, with some batches containing dangerous levels. Immediate effects were often dismissed at the time, but documented in unit medical records. Soldiers exposed to fresh Agent Orange spray reported burning sensations on skin, respiratory irritation, nausea, and rashes. These symptoms were usually temporary, lasting hours to days. More serious immediate reactions occurred in heavily exposed personnel. Spray crew, personnel handling barrels, soldiers who were directly sprayed during aerial operations, these individuals sometimes developed severe skin conditions called chloracne, a characteristic symptom of dioxin exposure. The chloracne appeared weeks to months after exposure and could persist for years. One C-236 crew member's medical record, documented in later VA studies, showed he developed severe chloracne within 2 months of beginning spray missions. His face, back, and arms developed painful, cystic acne that didn't respond to treatment. This was direct evidence of dioxin exposure effects, but at the time, the connection wasn't officially acknowledged. Spray operations put enormous amounts of Agent Orange into the environment. The C-236 aircraft would fly at 150 feet altitude, spraying 1,000 gallons per mission. The herbicide would drift on wind, coating everything downwind: jungle, water sources, base camps, American positions. Multiple documented incidents involve American units being sprayed with Agent Orange. Sometimes this was accidental, spray missions straying off course, or wind pushing chemicals onto friendly positions. Other times, units were told to remain in areas that were about to be sprayed, with assurances the chemical was safe. One battalion operating in the Central Highlands reported being sprayed with defoliant while in position. The operation continued with no pause for the unit to relocate. Soldiers remained in their positions, coated with Agent Orange, for days. Years later, that battalion showed elevated rates of cancers and other health problems compared to other units. Contaminated base camps represented another exposure route. When perimeters and surrounding areas were defoliated, base camps ended up covered in Agent Orange residue. The chemical would mix with soil and persist. Soldiers ate, slept, and lived in contaminated areas. Water sources near defoliated areas became contaminated. Surface water would wash Agent Orange residue into streams and rivers. Wells could be contaminated by groundwater movement. The chemical persisted in soil and water far longer than anyone expected. The Defense Department claimed Agent Orange was safe, but their own studies showed otherwise. A 1967 study by the Bionatech's research laboratory found that 2,4,5-T caused birth defects and cancers in laboratory animals. This study was completed while spray operations continued and wasn't publicly disclosed for years. The dioxin problem makes Agent Orange unique among the chemicals used in Vietnam. TCDD dioxin is extraordinarily toxic and persistent. It doesn't break down readily. It accumulates in fatty tissue. It causes cancers, birth defects, immune system damage, and numerous other health problems. Soldiers exposed to Agent Orange were carrying dioxin in their bodies for the rest of their lives. The chemical would slowly release from fatty tissue, causing damage decades after exposure. This delayed toxicity meant that soldiers who felt fine immediately after exposure developed serious health problems years or decades later. Fred A. Wilcox's Waiting for an Army to Die documents the emerging health crisis among Vietnam veterans in the 1970s and 1980s. Cancers, neurological disorders, birth defects in children, all appearing at elevated rates in veterans who had been exposed to Agent Orange. Official denial and recognition took decades. The VA initially denied that Agent Orange exposure caused health problems. Veterans sick from dioxin exposure were told their illnesses weren't service-connected. Medical evidence accumulated slowly. Epidemiological studies, dioxin levels measured in veterans' blood, correlations between exposure and disease. The first official recognition came in 1991 when the Agent Orange Act acknowledged connection between herbicide exposure and certain cancers. Additional conditions were added to the list over subsequent decades as evidence accumulated. But the recognition came too late for thousands of veterans who died from Agent Orange-related illness while their claims were denied.
The scale of exposure is difficult to comprehend. Estimates suggest 2.6 to 3.2 million American service members were exposed to Agent Orange during the war. Not all exposures were equal. Spray crew had massive exposure, while some support personnel had minimal exposure. But millions of soldiers, Marines, sailors, and airmen came into contact with this chemical. The areas sprayed covered roughly 24% of South Vietnam. Approximately 3,181 villages were sprayed directly. The ecological damage was immense. Forests destroyed, agricultural land contaminated, water sources poisoned. The human cost is still being calculated. Vietnamese civilian impact exceeded American military exposure by orders of magnitude. Vietnamese civilians lived in sprayed areas permanently. They drank contaminated water, ate contaminated food, breathed contaminated air. Their children were born exposed. Multiple generations have been affected. The scientific evidence on Agent Orange's effects is now overwhelming. The CDC, VA, and numerous independent studies have documented the connections between dioxin exposure and various cancers, neurological diseases, immune system disorders, and birth defects. What was denied for decades is now officially recognized. Why Agent Orange was saved for last isn't just about long-term effects, it's about scale. More soldiers were exposed to Agent Orange than all other chemical weapons combined. The exposure was prolonged and unavoidable. The health consequences have been more severe and persistent than any other chemical used in Vietnam. Unlike chemicals that caused immediate casualties in specific incidents, Agent Orange created a slow-motion catastrophe that affected millions and continues affecting veterans and their families today. The immediate chemical threats in Vietnam could kill you during the war. Agent Orange killed you decades after you came home. Subscribe for more documented history. Check the sources in the description. Everything here is based on military records, medical studies, and extensive documentation. Thanks for your service, and thanks for watching.